Good morning, students. We are jumping back into Unbroken today, and we're going to be doing two things as we read through part 4. One is we're going to be paying attention to the way that Laura Hillenbrand tells Louis' story. And the second thing we're going to be doing is exploring a theme in this part of the book. So the first thing I want to kind of show you and talk about is looking at the author's techniques. Some of these we've talked about in class already, and you'll probably recognize them as we talk about them. One technique that the author uses is what's called pacing. That means how long does it take the author to talk about or to describe an event that's happening. For example, when Louis crashes into the ocean, she takes 2 pages to go through and describe every single thing that happened in detail, which really the crash only took seconds to happen. But by slowing that pacing down, it allows us to feel like we are there and experiencing each little thing. And I don't know if this has happened to you before, but when something traumatic happens, it really does literally feel like life is moving in slow motion. Our brains become very aware of every single little detail. And so her pacing just helps to communicate that, and we really feel like we're there experiencing this traumatic event. Another thing that an author can use is varying their sentence fluency and structure. Think about how short or long sentences are, how parts of the sentences are connected to make meaning, what connecting words you have between sentences. We looked at this a little bit in OK for Now when we looked at how those really short one-word sentences kind of created some tension or can help to communicate action, versus longer sentences that are more descriptive, that seem more calm and paced. So that structure of the sentence itself can kind of change the meaning. It can help ideas flow from one word to another word, from a phrase to phrase, or from a sentence to sentence. It can communicate that formal tone or more of a conversational tone. Think about, when you're formally writing, you write in full, complete sentences. When you're conversing, you usually communicate in short words and phrases, not necessarily full sentences. So that sentence structure is used to communicate lots of different things in writing. Another technique an author can use is figurative language, using metaphors, similes, hyperboles, oxymoron. For example, the plane's lifeblood, oil, hydraulic fluid, and some 1,000 gallons of fuel slopped on the surface. This really helps us to envision the scene because we can think about this plane almost like a person whose, lifeblood, guts have been spilled all over the ocean. It kind of creates this tone of something catastrophic having happened to them. Description is just when the author gives details about events, like the men's scalded skin cracked and their lips ballooned, bulging against their nostrils and chins. It just helps us to visualize the setting and what's happening. Transitions, how an author moves from one subject to another. Think about the example when we looked at how the author moved between what was happening in the world, what was happening with Louis. What was happening in the world with Japan and with Germany, back to Louis' story. Kind of weaving that sequencing and transitioning back and forth helped us understand how those life events would become connected to how those world events would become connected to Louis' life. So transitions will help establish changes in time or place. A few more. Word choice. This is when the author chooses a specific word. For example, flies, lice, and mosquitoes teemed on him. Teemed is a precise word meaning that they swarmed. So that helps us kind of envision it's not just a few flies or lice flying around, but they are swarming the captives, which ultimately is, of course, a lot more miserable. Sensory language means using the 5 senses: sight, smell, sound, touch, taste, kinds of language. Think about Louis' moment in the middle of the ocean, the strange stillness, the ocean stretched, glossy, smooth, the pause of the wind, the water looking so solid like they could walk on it. When a fish broke the surface, the sound carried to them. Using all of those senses helps us feel like we experience those things that the character experiences, helps put us into the story. Last week before spring break, we looked at active versus passive voice. and how active voice really emphasizes the subject that does the action, where passive voice emphasizes the action itself, because the subject really receives the action of the sentence, and how that changes the emphasis of what we are focused on in the writing. So that is an overwhelming list, I know, when you're looking at that all at once. I want you just with each chapter that you read to pick one of these techniques, just one, and look for an example of it in the chapter. So for each chapter you read, you're going to record one example of one of these techniques. So for instance, as you're looking at today's chapter, chapter 18, starting on page 139, the title of this chapter is A Dead Body Breathing. Right away, I see there's some figurative language there. A dead body and breathing are two opposite things being put together. That's an oxymoron. And it helps us to really kind of envision how bad it was for these captives when we think about a dead body breathing. Like they're dead but still alive. That's pretty bleak. As I read through this first page, I read, as the man left, the guard looked challenging at Louis, lifting a flattened hand to his throat, making a slashing gesture. Right? Hillenbrand is describing how somebody might, make that cutting your throat motion to emphasize that those captives are dead men. And then at the bottom we have, the example that I gave before, the flies, lice, and mosquitoes teeming on him, that precise word choice. So you're going to find several different techniques in every chapter that you read. Don't be overwhelmed by that huge list. Just pick one thing to look for as you're reading. The second thing that we're doing as we read is we're thinking about the theme in this section of the book. One of the things that kind of comes out in this part of the book is how the Japanese work to make their captives invisible. And we're not just talking literal, but figuratively invisible. Literally, as the men capture Louis and his mates, they are hidden away. Nobody knows that they're alive. They're physically and literally invisible to the rest of the world. And yet, they're also becoming figuratively invisible in this section of the book. The captives, in a sense, become invisible to themselves because their identity, their freedom, their agency, their self-worth, their existence as humans start to be erased by the captives, by their captors, I mean. So as you're reading through this section, I want you to think about what it is that the Japanese do that make these men feel invisible figuratively. How are they dehumanized, made to feel like they're not human beings? And how are they isolated and separated from other people? On page 140, Hillenbrand talks about why the Japanese attacked the men's dignity and sense of self as they did. She says, on Kwajalein, the guards deprived them of something deeper, dignity. This self-respect and sense of self-worth, the innermost armament of the soul, lies at the heart of humanness. To be deprived of it was to be dehumanized, leaving victims in a state of profound wretchedness and loneliness, unable to hang on to hope. Few societies treasured dignity and feared humiliation as did the Japanese, for whom loss of honor could merit suicide. This is probably one of the reasons why Japanese soldiers in World War II debased their prisoners with such zeal, seeking to take from them that which was most painful and destructive to lose. On Kwajalein, Louis and Phil learned a dark truth known to the doomed in Hitler's death camps, the slaves of the American South, and 100 other generations of betrayed people. Dignity is as essential to human life as water, food, and oxygen. The stubborn retention of it, even in the face of extreme physical hardship, can keep a man alive long past the point when he should have died. The loss of it can carry a man off as surely as thirst, hunger, exposure, and asphyxiation, and with greater cruelty. In places like Kwajalein, degradation could be as lethal as a bullet. So as you're reading, not only are we looking how Hilarion Hillenbrand tells Louis' story, we also want to pay attention to what's happening to the captives in this prisoner of war camp amongst the Japanese, and look for the ways in which they are degraded and debased and made to feel like they're no longer human. And how is it that they resist this? We know that from the beginning, Louis has been rebellious and one to make his own choices and resist, which is why he has been able to survive everything he has so far on the raft. How does he also resist this dehumanizing aspect of the Japanese in the POW camps? All right, I'm going to turn you loose to listen and or read chapter 18. You're going to find one technique Laura Hillenbrand uses to tell the story. And if you find any examples of the captives being made to feel invisible, literally or figuratively, record those in your chart.